Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is a presentation of the State-Federal RPS Collaborative, which is run by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and our topic today is hydropower and renewable portfolio standards. And our host for this webinar will be Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA. And before I pass it over to him, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees today are in listen-only mode. That means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options for connecting to the audio portion of the webinar. You can either call in using your telephone, or you can use your computer mic and speakers. There's some instructions there on your screen and on your webinar console. A very important note, please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box and hitting send. And we will read through your questions as you come in. We're saving time at the end of our presentations today to have a Q&A with our speakers. So type your questions in when you think of them. Don't wait till the end. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar in addition to the webinar slides, and all of our previous CESA webinars, those are available on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass this over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon.
Hey, thank you, Samantha. The Clean Energy States Alliance, we're a national organization. We're a coalition of public agencies, mostly state agencies across the country, and you could see logos of most of our members on this slide. And one of the things we do, if we can go to the next slide, is to coordinate the RPS Collaborative. And this is something that's funded by the Energy Foundation and the US Department of Energy, and it's open to state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and anybody else who's interested in the current status and the future of state renewable portfolio standards. We run a lot of webinars. We have a free monthly newsletter. We do an annual summit. And if you want to get on our mailing list, go to our website, CESA.org, and you can sign up for the mailing list so you'll find out about future RPS collaborative events. And the next slide. Well, today we're focusing on hydropower and RPSs. And we're going to hear three perspectives here from three very well-informed individuals who play key roles within the wonderful world of hydropower. And each one of them will have a presentation, and then we'll have questions at the end. And I'll introduce each one before their presentation. Our first presentation is going to be by David Zayas, who's been with the National Hydropower Association since 2011. He's responsible for managing that organization's Regulatory Affairs Committee, its Small Hydro Council, Hydraulic Power Committee, and Operational Excellence Program. He represents NHA before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, before federal land management agencies, and before other federal agencies. He graduated from Vermont Law School with a JD and also a master's in environmental law policy. Let me turn it over to David.
Great. Thank you, Warren. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And again, thanks for the Clean Energy States Alliance for inviting NHA to speak on this webinar. I believe this discussion is timely, and we're seeing a lot of renewed interest in hydropower across the country, and I'm very excited to present to this group. So slide 2 in front of everybody now is my presentation outline, and before kind of going through this, I would just highlight quickly that each speaker today has about 15 minutes, so my remarks are going to be pretty high level and won't examine any specific state in detail. I'm happy to discuss this presentation with anyone afterwards or on the phone or a follow-up webinar if there's interest. So my contact information is at the end of these slides. So, however, I will provide an overview of the industry, touch quickly on state RPS activity and the general treatment of hydropower in these policies, Then I'll transition into some of the growth opportunities available to states, and with a focus on some of the low-hanging fruit that folks may or may not be aware of. Briefly discuss the Clean Power Plan and hydropower's treatment within it, highlight a few state initiatives that are also advancing hydropower, and then close with some key takeaways. So quickly about NHA, we are the National Trade Association for the hydropower industry. We represent all facets of the industry from conventional hydro, pump storage, and marine and hydrokinetics. Our members are large and small and include owners and operators from investor-owned utilities, public power entities, cooperatives, independent power producers, but also the service side of the industry, which includes the manufacturers and engineering firms, among others. Quickly, this is my one-slide summary of the industry, and I would really just draw your attention, well, to both sides, but on the left-hand side, this was 2014 renewable electricity generation in the United States in terawatt hours, and you'll see that hydropower accounted for 48% of renewable generation in the United States, followed by wind at 35%, biomass at 12%, and then solar and geothermal of 3% each, rounding out to 6% in total. On the right-hand side, I won't walk through all of these bullet points there just for folks to look at afterwards, but I would draw your attention to that fourth bullet down, and lots of times when we talk about hydropower, people are surprised to see that of that, approximately 100 gigawatts of installed capacity, it's a 50-50 split between the public and private side and the federal government, which is the Army Corps of Engineers, Tennessee Valley Authority, and Bureau of Reclamation. And then the next bullet below that, you'll see that although the federal government is 50% of installed capacity, they only own 8% of the infrastructure. So we're usually talking about federal government has a lot of the larger facilities in the United States, whereas the public and private ownership is usually much smaller but has many more numbers. And then again, the last bullet is just a quick nod to some of the other benefits that the industry and the associated infrastructure provides, such as flood control, irrigation, water supply, and recreation. So my next slide here is kind of my attempt at summarizing state RPS activity, and I would note that Galen Barbos at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab gave really a terrific overview of key trends in RPSs just last week, and I would encourage people to look at Galen's presentation for a deeper dive into this RPS activity across the board. But from our brief research, between 2000 and 2015, I found a report that said there was, over 250 RPS bills introduced across the country, and the majority of those are activity related to modifications and revisions to existing policies. I think this was something that was also noted by Galen last week. And then to the highlighted and underlined bullet in the middle of that page is that we're seeing a lot of interest in increasing or expanding hydropower's role and eligibility in these programs. And it kind of, in our mind, it begs the question, why are we seeing this activity and interest in hydro? And I think bottom line is that it's because hydro is treated very differently in RPSs compared to other sources like wind and solar. As states approach their target dates or if they are experiencing difficulty in meeting their requirements, I think like the Northeast, they're realizing the value that hydropower provides in addition to its carbon-free generation, like baseload power and the ability to provide or to integrate large amounts of variable generation and other ancillary services. So the first bullet on this slide is really just kind of a summary of the varying treatment of hydro in RPSs across the country. Often there's capacity limitations, there's placed in service restrictions, resource and technology limitations, or explicit environmental and operational criteria, among others. And then the following four bullets below that is just kind of some interesting tidbits we noticed when looking at RPSs. So conduits and canal development is something I'm going to talk about today. And interestingly, only one state that we found explicitly included conduit technology as an eligible resource. Pump storage, something I won't talk about today, is kind of mixed. There's a total of 12 states that mention pump storage. 7 recognize it as an eligible technology, although it's usually limited by its capacity. There's a capacity limitation usually, because when we talk about pump storage, those can be much bigger projects of 600-700 megawatts or more. And there was 5 states that explicitly prohibited pump storage. And then MHK, there's a lot more recognition of marine and hydrokinetic technologies in RPSs, which is very encouraging. And then something we talk about a lot, or we get a lot of questions about, is whether Canadian hydropower is eligible in state RPSs. And from our research, we found that 9 states do consider hydro from Canada to be eligible, with a focus of those states in the Northeast or those that are located on the Canadian border. And finally, I would just mention that you would see similar treatment of hydro in voluntary markets as well as mandatory. So quickly, I'm going to now kind of get into the substance of my presentation, and that's kind of talking about some of the growth opportunities in the industry, such as existing infrastructure, which is non-power dams and conduits and canals, and then capacity additions and efficiency improvements. And I highlight these today because I think, one, they're the low-hanging fruit, and some RPSs recognize these types of hydro development, others don't. But again, my goal is to share what the opportunities are as states consider their future policies and modifications. And then as a caveat, I would say too that these aren't the only areas of growth in the industry, but because of our time constraints, I won't talk about pump storage potential, where there's over 20,000 megawatts of proposals in front of FERC right now. I'm not going to discuss new stream reach development or MHK potential, but both of which DOE has conducted resource assessments on. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Department of Energy's NonPower Dam Report that was issued in 2012. What DOE did is looked at the existing infrastructure across the country, and they identified all of the sites of potential capacity of 1 megawatt or more. And what they came out with was 12 gigawatts of potential at over 54,000 non-power dams across the country, which is pretty significant. And again, for those that may have just different backgrounds, 1 gigawatt is equal to 1,000 megawatts. The report also highlighted that there's 80,000 dams nationwide in the United States, and only 3% of those are equipped to power or with power generation. And then if we drill down a little bit more into those 12 gigawatts of potential, we see that 8 gigawatts are located in the top 100 sites, and then 81 of those top 100 sites are dams owned by the US Army Corps of Engineers. And I'm not going to talk about, it's a whole other topic probably in webinar to talk about licensing and permitting hydropower and Corps of Engineers infrastructure, but it's something that a lot of our members are pursuing, and you just see as a large opportunity in the future. Just a couple slides that I pulled out of this non-power dams report, and for those with an interest, I would encourage you to take a look at it as well. But the top 10 states with the most non-power dam potential are listed here. So for those of you from Illinois, Kentucky, through Iowa, you may or may not know that you have this potential in your state at existing infrastructure. And then this next slide is just a snapshot of all 50 states and what their potential is in that report. And again, not going to walk through this, but just providing it for information for folks to look at later. The second piece I wanted to highlight in terms of growth in the industry is on conduits and canals. So, there's also, like non-power dams, there's tremendous infrastructure related to these types of development, and they're generally very small projects. If I refer back to my earlier slide in our review of RPSs, only one state, California, recognized conduit development in their RPSs. But there's two significant things that have happened in this area. One was the Hydropower Regulatory Efficiency Act of 2013. This removed qualifying conduits from FERC jurisdiction, meaning that a person interested in developing on a qualifying conduit doesn't have to get a FERC license or a FERC exemption. And again, the FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, responsible for licensing hydropower projects. So now, under this new law for a qualifying conduit, a developer only needs to submit a notice of intent to construct this facility. There's a website there for folks that may be interested. And since 2013, this provision has been used significantly. There's been 57 projects have received a qualifying conduit status, representing over 24,000 kilowatts. Again, pretty small projects, but can make an impact cumulatively. The second thing I would highlight is the Bureau of Reclamation's Lease of Power Privilege Program, which is gaining momentum. In the last few years, Reclamation has approved a number of projects representing over 49,000 kilowatts at Reclamation-owned infrastructure. And again, they have also done their own resource assessments in this area and have identified hundreds of potential sites and thousands of additional kilowatts that could be contributing to a state RPS program. And the last thing I would also say about conduits and canals that could be important for RPSs is that the timelines are short for these projects in terms of getting them approved and up and running. So for example, FERC generally approves a notice of intent within 2 to 3 months, and then a developer can begin construction of the project. Under the Lease of Power Privilege Program, we see that from project initiation to operations, that means it's online, up and running, and generating renewable power is between 2.5 and 3 years. So I think within the time frames of many RPSs. And then third area of growth to highlight for everybody today is just capacity additions and efficiency improvements at existing hydro facilities. So I know some RPSs recognize efficiency improvements similar to how hydro is treated under the federal production tax credit. So I just included there for everybody what that definition is. But more importantly, I think, is the second bullet. And since hydro's inclusion in the PTC, FERC has certified 149 projects and, over 1.8 million megawatt hours. And I think significantly is that what FERC has reported is that on average, these facilities are increasing their generation by 9.5%. So for states that may have, any existing hydropower, an extra 9.5% of generation could be significant. And I think, to summarize all three of these areas of growth, one of the themes is that, none of this growth would change existing operations or divert flows at these facilities. And, in our view, it's probably some of the lowest impact developments in the energy sector. Just one slide on the Clean Power Plan, and I know there's a lot of text here, and I don't plan on reading it, but the point I want to make is just that, new hydropower, similar to other renewable energy technologies constructed after 2012, is an eligible compliance option for states in the Clean Power Plan. So, I think this was a significant improvement over the proposed rule. We were very excited for hydropower's inclusion and as a compliance option. And I know right now there is tremendous amount of state planning going on regarding implementation plans, how do RPSs interact with those implementation plans, whether states will take the state measures approach. But, I think the bottom line from our perspective is that hydropower will play an important role in the Clean Power Plan compliance moving forward. This is my second to last slide, and I'm not going to walk through this text either just because we're limited on time, but there's a number of states who are also advancing hydropower outside of RPSs. They're signing MOUs with FERC. They're looking at ways to improve the licensing process. They're looking at ways to improve fish passage at dams statewide. So just a highlight for this group, there's a lot of activity at states looking at growing their hydropower resources. I would encourage you to reach out to these folks or myself if it's helpful, and I can put you in touch with anybody who's working on these initiatives. So finally, my last slide and my key takeaways. First, I think the current RPS policies have provided some value to the hydropower industry, but eligibility requirements are limiting participation in new development. Second, REC revenue would certainly incentivize new development and provide key project financing. On this point, I think it's important to mention that, similar to wind and solar and other technologies, hydropower projects are competing against the same economics supporting natural gas development, for example. So for some of these projects, and some that are very small and have very tight margins, REC revenue can determine whether they pencil out or not. The third point I would make is that hydropower eligibility and recognition will provide an important source of carbon-free electricity for states in future RPSs and Clean Power Plan compliance. We've talked today about states that are revisiting RPSs and renewable energy policies to include hydropower. And then finally, I would just say that, the energy landscape is changing compared to when the first RPSs were passed over a decade ago. And this activity is reflected in the modifications to RPSs, federal legislation like the Hydropower Regulatory Efficiency Act and even the Water Resources Reform and Development Act of 2014 that directed the Army Corps of Engineers to improve their hydropower licensing process. And it kind of gets all wrapped up into, the debate about climate change and challenges facing the country in the future because of climate change, and that every megawatt hour of clean and renewable generation is important, and hydropower industry looks forward to providing a solution. And that's my last slide, and I, again, appreciate Warren and CESA for inviting us to present today.
Hey, David, thank you very much. That was a really good overview and gets the webinar started off well. I do want to mention a couple of amendments that people wrote in about to a couple of your slides. One is that Wisconsin is another state that recognizes some Canadian hydro. In Wisconsin, Manitoba hydro can meet the RPS if certain criteria are met. And then Massachusetts recognizes conduit technology under its rubric of hydrokinetic technologies. But let's move on to our next presentation, and this is going to be by Dana Hall. And Dana is Deputy Director of the Low Impact Hydropower Institute, where she manages administrative and financial operations, and she manages Lehigh's work on renewable policy markets. Before joining the staff back in 2013, she was Secretary of the Lehigh Governing Board for 4 years. She previously worked as an attorney offering legal and regulatory support services for clean energy clients. She also has experience as an energy policy analyst and has taught clean energy courses at the Cooper Union School in New York. And with that, let me turn it over to Dana. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Good afternoon. I'm Dana Hall. I'm Deputy Director for the Low Impact Hydropower Institute. And I'd like to thank Clean Energy States Alliance for programming this webinar on hydropower for the RPS Collaborative. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share information about the Institute and our certification program with this very important audience. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists for collaborating on this program and want to recognize that Leahy's Executive Director, Dr. Michael Sale, is also in attendance today, and he's available in addition for questions at the end of the presentation if there's time. So my presentation today focuses on the Institute and our Low Impact Certification Program. I'll be presenting on who and what Leahy is, why we were founded on the premise that there's a need for low impact certification, how our program works, and how it is used in various markets. I'll also close with a bit about our future and the future of low impact hydropower and the value that we offer our stakeholders. Okay, so I'm clicking Sam and it's not, whoops, too far. Okay, there we go. So Leahy was formed by a working group of concerned experts back in 1999. The motivation of developing low impact certification came at a time when renewable markets were nascent. Only a handful of states had begun experimenting with RPS at that time. The working group was operating on the premise that consumers would find some value in an objective third-party determination that a particular hydroelectric resource is green and should be included in renewable markets alongside non-hydro renewables. Our purpose, which is stated here in our Articles of Incorporation, is to set criteria to characterize low-impact hydropower and to develop a certification program that uses these criteria towards the goals of reducing the environmental impacts and providing a credible standard that consumers can accept. Another purpose that you see here is for us to provide information to the public about the environmental effects of energy generation. Our mission statement essentially incorporates this purpose to reduce the impacts of hydropower generation through voluntary certification. Our governance is, according to our bylaws, must be comprised of a minimum of half board representation from environmental NGOs. The organizations you see here on the slide have provided our board with representation, and these individuals serve in an individual capacity, although they do work closely with their organizations to help reduce the impacts of hydropower generation. Our board is diverse. It's not just NGOs. We also have representation from industry, from government and from the private sector. And you can visit our website to learn more about how we are governed and which stakeholders are involved in our process. The diversity of the stakeholder interest that's involved in the hydropower community is broad. I know you can hear from David's presentation on the FERC license, when he mentioned FERC licensing, there are a lot of stakeholders engaged in this universe. And for our program to be successful, it's really essential that LEHEAP governance represent the diversity. So why certified hydropower? Let's talk about the impacts of hydropower. Yes, there is a long, successful history of clean electricity generation from hydropower, our largest renewable source. It also has a mixed history of environmental performance. Dams block natural river flows. Structures in rivers result in mortality of migrating fish and wildlife. There's adverse changes in water quality. Destruction from the flooding of riparian ecosystems and recreational opportunities are also eliminated at certain times. The impacts are controversial and have long been part of a national conversation, and recent films like Damnation contribute to that dialogue by shining a spotlight on the devastating environmental impacts of bad dams. LEHEAP fully supports the broad efforts happening around the U.S. to remove bad dams. In fact, dams recommended for removal are not eligible to apply for LEHEAP certification. However, the Institute focuses on a very site-specific approach. Every single one of the impacts that affect the natural environment from hydropower are site-specific, and there are very real opportunities for minimizing and reducing the adverse impacts of hydropower. So LEHEAP certification is useful in avoiding the oversimplification of the complexity of these hydropower impacts and being careful not to dismiss all dams as harmful. There are many risks that can take place from just assuming all dams are bad. Dams exist all across our infrastructure for non-power purposes. We heard about that from David: water supply, flood control, irrigation, navigation, sediment control, and all of this is part of a national infrastructure which is aging and in need of improvement. And there are many opportunities to put new, clean, renewable power on a lot of these existing dams. And more than that, the dams that exist that do have power, there are many real opportunities to reduce the environmental impacts of those operations as well. So where are we? And this slide is to show you that LEHEAP is a national program. I'm not sure how many folks on the line are familiar with us, which is why we're grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today. But we do have certified facilities in 28 states. Currently, we have 123 active certificates installed on approximately 170 dams. The total capacity is almost 4.5 gigawatts. One thing I want to note, the graph on the lower left here was generated, I think, in early 2014, and we have had some new certifications since then. But the trend remains. You can see that more of our capacity, or more of our certificates, I should say, are in New England. Hydropower projects can be all sizes, and LEHEAP does not evaluate the size of a facility as a factor of our certification criteria or eligibility requirements. Rather than looking at size, we look at how a project is sited and where it's sited, and how it's operated. In general, it's risky to assume that small projects are environmentally sound and large ones are not. I think that's common in the lexicon and the understanding of hydropower, but the Institute tries to take the opportunity to inform people that there can be a small project, maybe sited at the mouth of a river, that can potentially destroy fish populations over hundreds of river miles, where you could have a large project like the 700 megawatt Skagit project in Washington State that's well operated, has a strong commitment to river protection and healthy fish populations, and the energy output from 700 of those 1 megawatt projects can be much more of a dangerous environmental footprint than the single 700 megawatt project. This is a very important reason why he does not consider size or use size as an elimination factor for eligibility. So let's talk a little bit about our criteria. The Leahy criteria look at what some states have in their RPS. We look at the flow of the river, water quality, how fish populations are surviving going up and down the river, watershed protection, the natural environment and the buffer zone around the river, if there are threatened and endangered species nearby the site, and also 2 additional criteria: cultural resources, historic preservation, Indian tribe sites, and the human value of recreation and access to the river. So these are our essential criteria. And eligibility is another component of our program. The eligibility that we use now is focused primarily on the United States. And as I mentioned a minute ago, there's no size requirement to apply. But we also don't have an age requirement. As I mentioned before, our mission is to reduce the environmental impacts of hydropower. And if we created a barrier related to age and say the project's older than a certain year can't apply, then we would be inhibiting our own ability to carry out this important mission. Another component of eligibility is that we will examine projects only if they're installed on a dam. That dam has to have been constructed on or before August 1998. There are some other projects that are not eligible. We don't look right now at projects located outside the United States, marine hydrokinetics, pump storage, and also dams recommended for removal, which I mentioned. It's important to note that these factors of eligibility are not because the Institute has a position that these things cannot be low impact. These eligibility requirements stem from the original criteria, which were first thought through the working group in 1998 and 1999. And there was a general approach that the criteria should not be, especially with the August 1998 cutoff, that the criteria should not become a means to encourage new dam construction. If that were to change, if any of these eligibility components were to change, then the board would examine our criteria to make sure that our criteria can examine the impacts associated with some of these new eligibility components. Leahy's bylaws do require periodic programmatic review. Our criteria and our eligibility are examined by our governing board. And if any of them change, then the board does a deliberative process and also an open and transparent process to examine and consider what we might want to change. And this is because river environments change, and our program is meant to be responsive to that. And very soon, within a month, maybe 6 weeks, Leahy will be announcing a program update, including a second edition of our handbook and a revision of our existing criteria. The changes are going to provide a menu of alternative standards that an applicant can use to demonstrate they've satisfied the criteria, and more opportunities for longer certification terms. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that until it's launched, but Mike Sale could take questions about that after the presentation if there's time in the Q&A. I'm just going to quickly tell you about our process. We start with an initial stage we call intake review, which is an informal consultation and also a confidential consultation where an applicant sends us a draft application. We review it against the criteria and let them know what information might be missing or what issues there might be in demonstrating satisfaction of each criterion. The applicant then takes that back to their own project and considers whether or not they want to proceed to the next step. If they do, the next step is the formal application, where we review the application materials, provide a 60-day public notice and comment period, and then make a recommendation to the board to certify. In some cases, the decision to certify is delegated to our executive director. Once the decision has been made and the project is certified, the participation in the program continues with an annual compliance obligation. This is because we want to do a status check to ensure that the conditions, that the criteria continue to be satisfied, and if there are any special conditions imposed at the time of the decision, that those are also being met with and the obligations are being met with. At the end of a term, the project does a process called recertification, where they resubmit their application just to ensure that their material operations haven't changed, and also if the WIHI certification criteria has changed. That can usually be a very quick process, although sometimes it will go to a second phase similar to the first initial application, which has the intake review and formal application. The recertification process also includes a public notice and comment period. Okay, so I mentioned public notice and comment just now. Some of the stakeholders engaged in this process are the state resource agencies, and not just environmental agencies, but historic preservation and other groups. There's also the opportunity for local community groups and environmental NGOs to participate. So we do provide a transparent and broad access to all communities that are engaged in the river. We also will encourage satisfaction of the criteria by sometimes requiring conditions to be satisfied. Perhaps something like eel passage might need to be constructed, a water quality study. These could be things that are not a component of the FERC license, but they came out of our review and our examination of the WIHI certification criteria and how the project stands up against the criteria. This is really an important factor of our program because it provides accountability and helps maintain the credibility of the certification program. Excuse me, we often get asked what it costs to get certified, and so this slide is just to show you the range of what the fees are. That initial private confidential intake process is a flat $950 fee, the same for any project that applies. When they come back for the second round of the formal application, that can range depending on the condition of their application and how complex the review is, but the range is typically between $3,000 and up to $10,000. I would say the median, or what we're seeing most commonly, is towards the lower end of that range. We also charge annual fees, which is a component of the average generation output, and that is also framed around a floor and a cap. For small projects that generate not that much, we do have a $1,000 minimum fee. For large projects, it's a $30,000 annual cap. There are sometimes fees imposed with conditions, which is purely to help WIHI recover the costs that it takes to evaluate the responses to the conditions in the annual compliance, and that is a range from 0 to 1,000. And then there's a flat fee for the first phase of recertification with a second. If phase 2 is initiated in recertification, there's a range on that as well. I wanted to draw attention also in terms of what markets are what markets make use of the WIHI certification. The Clean Energy States Alliance published a great report in 2013 called The Environmental Rules for Hydropower and State RPS. I would suggest that everybody check that out. This slide is just to demonstrate the states that have some kind of environmental criteria on how they find hydropower to be eligible for RPS, and the specific states, Delaware, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, which require certification from WIHI for demonstration of eligibility. Want to talk just quickly? I'll go through these next couple slides quickly. There are some really exciting things happening in technology, in low-impact technology. Aerating turbines are a way to put more oxygen into the river, which helps improve water quality. Really innovative, exciting ways that fish are able to pass over barriers in rivers, and more sophisticated ways to control the operation of turbines for good, managing good and healthy flow regimes. So our program really, in a sense, is about investing in rivers and enhancing that legacy of existing infrastructure. There are many benefits that can result from low-impact certification. Preservation of historic treasures, economic development in projects that are underutilized or sitting barren that could be operating and providing green energy and local energy. And I wanted to just briefly demonstrate a specific example project that we have certified in New Hampshire. When it was certified, the condition was drafted and agreed to requiring the applicant or the owner of the project to work with the New Hampshire Department of Fish and Game and the US Fish and Wildlife Service to agree on a plan for downstream eel passage and also permanent upstream eel passage. And there was a timeline that was imposed, and this is part of the Leahy certificate. And then right on time, we got evidence from the owner that the eel passage was installed. They sent us photographs. They showed us that they had complied with the condition. And so these kinds of certification conditions can be very effective and helps to build good positive relationships between the owner and the community and the resource agencies. So to close, I just wanted to remind folks that we're kind of in the middle of this nexus of a range of stakeholders. And our certification program is voluntary. It's an independent program. However, it does provide a function to government. It also helps hydro owners unlocking a door to green markets and green market revenue. It's a pathway for environmental NGOs to foster that protection of valuable natural resources and build alliances with facility owners. And it's a means for purchasers and investors in hydropower to believe the claims of the developers and understand that the project that they're investing in and purchasing power from is truly a green project. So I think that's my last slide. I just wanted to thank CESA again and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Oh, I'm very sorry. This is Warren. I had myself on mute here. And thank you, Dana. We're going to move on to some very important work that the Department of Energy is doing. And we're going to hear from Tim Welch, who is Hydropower Program Manager for DOE's Wind and Water Power Technology Office. He joined the program in 2014 after 25 years at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's Division of Hydropower Licensing. He's a trained fishery biologist. He has a BA from Cornell University and a master's from Frostburg State University. So let me turn it over to Tim.
Okay, thank you very much, Warren. Again, thank you for CESA for inviting me to the webinar today. I appreciate any opportunity I can get to sort of talk about our program here at DOE. So both David and Dana gave you a little bit of a glimpse of how they see the future of hydropower, and I wanted to expand on that a little bit just to show you a little bit about sort of how DOE views the future of hydropower. So, oh boy.
If you click on that, there you go. Click on the screen.
Arrow.
There you go.
Got it. Thank you. So I wanted to cover 3 different areas here. First, I want to just touch briefly on our hydropower resource assessments. David talked about one of them earlier, and I'll talk about another one. Then I'd like to talk about, once again, giving a little glimpse into the future, specifically about our Hydro Next initiative for new hydropower technologies. And then finally, I'd like to wrap things up and tell you a little bit about our Hydropower Vision Report, which really does map out how DOE sees the future of hydropower in this country. So David mentioned earlier our resource assessment that was we did back in 2012 on existing non-power dams, and as David said, found that only 3% of the existing dams produce power. However, of 54,000 suitable non-power dams, or 50,000 suitable non-power dams, that has the potential of providing up to 12 gigawatts of new hydropower capacity. But the other resource assessment that David did not mention that we also did in 2014 was new stream reach development. These are areas that have good potential for hydropower new capacity, but have yet to be developed. And we found that once we take away the federally protected waters, potential hydropower development opportunities in the U.S. this is an additional 65 gigawatts of capacity. So these two resource assessments sort of provided the basis of our program and sort of begged the question, what is the best way to tap this future U.S. hydropower potential? So we came up with a program that's called our Hydro Next strategy. And it's an initiative that invests in new and innovative technologies for both existing non-power dams and new stream reach development. And this is the most important part, that dramatically change the way we think about hydropower. And we're looking like two different ways of how we change that. One, by lowering costs, and two, by promoting environmental stewardship. So these are the two big pillars of our HydroNext strategy going into the future. So to start with, we needed to decide how best to optimize the DOE investments in research. So what we did was we did a cost study of cost of developing a new hydropower project. And what we found is, and if you see in the circle, the dark blue, capital costs are 87% of the total project cost. And if you break that down further, you'll see that civil works comprises 44%, and electromechanical equipment, other words like powertrains, turbines, comprise 34%. So in those two particular areas, civil works and electromechanical equipment, that's where we decided to target our investments. So back in FY15, we launched a $7 million funding opportunity with this, answering the question, how can we lower costs of new unconstructed hydropower projects? Now, with regard to civil works, we are funding one project that is looking into modular prefabricated containers, those shipping containers of various colors that you see sort of in various use throughout the U.S. So these prefabricated containers can be filled with gravel and potentially used to build dams. So the idea here is this whole prefabricated concept that really lowers construction costs. Another project that we're investing in is using precast concrete modules. These are modules that are made in a factory and then shipped to the site rather than having to be constructed right on site. Now, with regard to powertrains, we're investing in how to make turbines from lightweight composite materials that can be even 3D printed. So these lightweight composite materials are much more resilient than the current turbines that we have now, and with their lightweight, they can have the potential of saving tremendous amount of dollars in transportation costs. Now, the third area that I think that I'm most excited about is some research that's going on at DOE's Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and that's standard modular hydropower. So standard modular hydropower is a design concept that sort of molds the two aspects of HydroNext, both cost and environmental impact, by ensuring fish passage and stream connectivity, innovating technology for remote operation and environmental monitoring, providing consistent flows and hydraulics for recreationists, and using advanced materials and manufacturing techniques. So the result of this Oak Ridge National Lab project, the result would be an exemplary modular design that can be used in a variety of riverine environments. So having said that, my big hope today is that you'd walk away from this webinar and sort of change the way you think about future hydropower, thinking specifically about the standard modular hydropower approach. So I think that I'm noted for saying it's not your grandfather's hydropower project anymore. In other words, it's not your standard, Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee. We've sort of seen the last of that type of development in the United States. This is a much smaller, modular approach for future new development. So what I have here is this is not a conceptual design at all. This is merely a cartoon, if you will, of something that just demonstrates the concept of what we're talking about when we talk about standard modular hydro. And it would be consisting of a generation module that could be anywhere in the river and not necessarily take the entire river, because there probably most likely would not be a standard dam and a reservoir. And then also included with that would be another module that would be specific for passage for kayaks or canoes or rafts, for fish, sediment and debris, and water quality concerns. So we are utilizing all kinds of stakeholders, both fishery biologists and recreationists and engineers, to sort of come up with these designs of these passage modules that can be used in conjunction with the generation modules to sort of make a new type of hydropower project that, as I said earlier, could be used in a variety of different situations. So I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the DOE's vision for the future of United States hydropower. So back in 2014, we began putting together this report, and this report will establish an analytical basis for suggested stakeholder actions that could usher in a new era of growth in sustainable domestic hydropower over the next half century, i.e. till 2050. So included in this effort are three areas: an examination of the current state of the hydropower industry, a discussion of costs and benefits to the nation arising from additional hydropower, and finally, and most importantly, a definitive roadmap that addresses these challenges and shows you how we can achieve higher levels of hydropower deployment within a sustainable U.S. energy mix. So throughout the document, you will see three different what we call pillars that are repeated over and over again. These are sort of our main issues that we will be examining in the vision. And the first is the maintenance and growth of the existing fleet, because we know that the U.S. Existing hydropower fleet, which is the oldest renewable, dating back to the 1880s, is a very important part of the nation's energy mix, providing important baseload functions for the grid and integration of other renewables such as wind and solar. So it's very important to preserve and optimize the value and generation contribution of this existing hydropower fleet. Now the second part is what do we see in the future? What is the new hydropower growth? And we will be doing an analysis that defines a credible yet visionary scenario, quote, giving various constraints, both economic and environmental options, to build on both non-power dams and developing new stream reaches and pump storage hydropower since through 2050. Now the third and probably most important of our pillars is sustainability. How do we do this growth responsibly? How do we ensure that the water energy system, with its multiple uses and values, both economic, social, and environmental, continues to function and improve? So just a quick overview of what the chapters are going to look like. We'll have an executive summary, of course. Then we'll present our actual vision for the hydropower's future up to 2030 and 2050. And then, as I mentioned, the state of the hydropower in the U.S., back from the first plant that was developed in 1882 to today. And that's going to sort of set our baseline for the vision. Then in Chapter 4, we'll be presenting our actual analysis, our impacts of the vision, our benefits, a reduction in greenhouse gases, water savings, grid stability, economic development, and price stability. And finally, and as I said before, most importantly, providing a solid, a definitive roadmap of what actions need to be taken to achieve this vision. So just a quick overview of how the vision is broken down. We talk about in the roadmap technology advancement, regulatory process improvement, multiple uses and benefits of hydropower, sustainable planning and siting, performance and reliability, market structures, collaboration, education and outreach, and workforce development. How can all these things, what are some definitive actions we can take in these areas to make hydropower a sustainable option for our energy future? So we began back in 2014, and we did not do this in a vacuum. We had many folks that are assisting DOE with this effort. We have 10 task forces totaling 300 experts from over 130 organizations such as federal agencies like the US Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, utilities such as Pacific Gas and Electric. We also engaged representatives from the environmental community, including American Rivers. And so basically we have a very broad stakeholder engagement, both proponents of hydropower and opponents of hydropower as well, so that we can have a credible, visionary report in the end. So where are we? So right now we have finished the draft report, and we're sending it out to about 30 external peer reviewers from various aspects of the environmental and hydropower development community. We're providing draft reports to OMB, our senior peer review group, our task forces, other federal agencies that we're cooperate with through our Memorandum of Understanding, and other DOE offices. So that is going out this week for draft. So then we will pull it back in and do an internal review process starting in April. And then the crescendo will be the big report release, which is this summer on July 26, 2016 at the National Hydropower Hydro Vision Conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So please just mark your calendars, and around the end of July, beginning of August, keep an eye out for our hydropower vision report. And that's all I have for you.
Hey, thank you very much, Tim. Well, we got something to look forward to in the coming months that should really be a quite valuable report. And let's switch to some questions. Just folks on the line to note, we're going to run over by about 5 to 7 minutes, so I hope many of you will be able to stay on the line to listen to some of the questions. And I have a question for Dana, and that is, obviously it costs something for a project to get certified. Once a project is certified, are they able to sell their electricity at a premium price?
Thanks, Warren, for that question and for the person who asked it. So it definitely varies based on where the project is located and what market they're eligible for. What we often find is that a project will come to us to apply for certification after they already have an off-taker lined up and are in the works of getting a REC contract together, and that off-taker, or purchaser, I should say, has requested Green E certification, and then Green E requires LEE certification. On the other hand, you might have in a market where there's really good pricing, a project pretty confident that they can find a purchaser if they have LEED certification, and they know what the market bears. And depending on how many projects they own and how sophisticated they are in the market, they'll go ahead and invest in LEED certification, knowing that they'll be able to sell their RECs. So it definitely varies regionally.
Great, thank you. Hey, David, one person wanted to know whether the National Hydropower Association has a position on LEHI and on its certification process.
Thanks, Warren, and thanks for the question. A good question, too. I would say I'd lead with NHA's position is that all hydropower is renewable and that it's hard to compare hydro to itself. So there, I think you can then understand that our members are divided on this issue where, some have certainly taken advantage of the LEHI certification as demonstrated in Dana's presentation, where others, disagree. So we kind of try to navigate our member interests. So bottom line is NHA is active in the LEHI program and its development, and we provide input to the program changes and qualifications as those opportunities arise.
And Tim, you talked about the modular hydro designs that you're developing. Given the great variation between different rivers and different watersheds, is it really realistic to have a modular approach that will be useful widely?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think what we're doing also in sort of in conjunction is that Oak Ridge National Laboratory are sort of classifying different rivers and different basins throughout the U.S. and sort of putting them into sort of broad categories, and using those sort of broad categories will feed that information into our standard modular siting protocols, and that way hopefully once we come up with a design or designs, we can identify the best areas, both biologically and hydraulically, where these modular systems would be able to work. That's a great question.
Well, this is a question for any of you folks. There's legislation pending before the Senate that is part of bipartisan energy legislation. And is one of you able to summarize what that legislation may mean for hydropower?
Folks are probably looking at me. This is Dave, waiting for me. I could provide a little bit of an overview in that. Yeah, I think it would be, a lot of important improvements to hydropower and the provisions that are included in the Senate bill. There was also a House bill that was passed late last year that had similar provisions included in it. I think, some of those provisions would, kind of help establish a schedule or, at FERC, where all stakeholders can certainly come together and stick to those schedules in terms of moving forward in the process. There's also a provision in there that would change the definition of hydropower from the federal government's renewable energy procurement perspective, where it's treated similarly to how RPSs treat hydropower, and so that would then make us eligible for federal procurement policies. So we think there's a lot of positive improvements in the Senate bill that would not undermine existing environmental protections.
Good, thank you. And Dana, one person wanted to know whether LEHI is at all considering certifying conduit technologies.
So one of the things that I think we have in our longer-term business plan is to diversify our product offerings, and we have been asked by many manufacturers to look at their technology. So I want to say someday in the future we will be doing that. We have been really very heavily engaged in updating our criteria and launching these programmatic updates. We'll probably take on eligibility next. But I think that you know, there are so many great new technologies, and if we got involved in that, it could help developers to, when they make decisions on which technologies to use. Actually, but I should really correct myself. We do certify conduits that are installed. So if you're asking about technology, that's a separate question. If you're asking about turbines that are installed in existing conduits, we do that. We have conduit installations that are certified low impact, and they're relatively easy to go through the criteria because if they're on a non-natural waterway, there's less impact other than drawing water from a natural source.
Well, very good. You know, I think we've come.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
This is Dave again. If I could just add to my previous statement, it was what I forgot to mention was also that NHA does have a separate website called unlockhydro.org that is related to the Senate and the House bills, and there's more information on there for folks who may be interested about what the bills, specific provisions of those bills would and would not do. So again, unlockhydro.org.
Hey, that's good to know because, you know, that legislation is being debated even as we speak, and there's a good chance that it's actually going to move forward. Well, you know, there's clearly a lot of interesting things going on in the hydropower world, and we're going to look forward to see what each of your organizations is up to in the coming months, especially be looking forward to the DOE HydroVision report coming out. I want to thank all of all the speakers today for participating, and this webinar recording will be placed on the CESA website. All the slides will be there, and I hope folks will come back and listen to future webinars, and I hope you'll join me in thanking today's speakers. So have a nice rest of your day.